Good morning. Welcome to our live session. I'm Eva Hussein, Director at Polaron. Today we're going to be talking about French language, which might be, to some of you, might seem like a strange choice to talk about in Australia, which is a multicultural society. But there's a very good reason why we're going to be talking about French. Last week we covered Spanish. And French is a language that is actually widely spoken in Australia by all kinds of people, not just French people. So let me introduce you to Dominic Carter, who you see up there in our Melbourne office. And Dominic is a bilingual French and English speaking person. He will introduce himself in a bit more detail. We also have Justine Pariseau down the bottom of your screen. From home today, because as you know, in Melbourne, everything's been rolled back and we're back in lockdown again, and we have to be, distancing again, so it's all happening. But Justine is a project manager at Polaron. This is her second stint with us. She was here last year, and now she's working on a lot of projects that we manage, and they're mostly multilingual. But both of these guys, so Dominic and Justine, first of all, they're native French speakers, but secondly, they have a lot of knowledge about the language. So I'll firstly get Andrea to start the slideshow going, because there's a few bits and pieces we wanted to show you. And then I'll hand over to Dominic, who will tell us a bit more about his knowledge of French and what it means to Australian communities, I guess, and then we move on to Justine's part of the presentation. So over to you, Dominic.
Hello, everybody, or bonjour. I'm Dominic, and I work at Polaron as a director, generally for financial matters. But I am an aficionado of the French language, so I've been quite happy to step in here and talk to you about French. I've worked in French. I was raised in French-speaking countries, and I have worked as a translator for many years. And French is a beautiful language, and it's a language that gives you access to a lot of people. So as you can see from this slide, for example, there are more than 76 million French native speakers in the world. It's probably around 300 million when you count people who have a second language. It's the fifth most spoken language as a consequence, and there are 29 countries, let's say, that have French as an official language. It's probably more because a lot of countries have French as a second official language too. For example, Luxembourg, where I've lived and worked for many years, has French as an official language, as well as German and Luxembourg. Okay, and around 20% of the European Union speak French. So it's already a very widely spoken language in the world, and it is also present in Australia. We'll talk about that in more detail later. Andrea, if you can move us to the next slide, and I'll give you some background on the French language here. J'aime le français, as you can see on the beautiful picture. It's a Romance language. It's often associated with romantic. But Romance language is a group of languages that come from Latin. It's got Italian in it, both forms of Spanish spoken in Spain, Portuguese, for example. It started off as a whole list of provincial dialects, and it got formalized into one sort of solid official language, let's say, around the 17th and 18th century. And there you go. Let's move to the next slide, because we don't have much time. The grammar of French language is much simpler than that of Latin, but it is still, for example, more complicated than English. Nouns aren't necessarily declined. So like in English, you just put an S for plural most of the time. There are lots of irregular plurals in French nonetheless, a bit like English. And then in English, for example, you don't really know if a word is masculine or feminine. In France, that makes a big difference. So there's an article in front of the word to tell you if a word is feminine or masculine. And the adjective has to change as well according to the gender of the word. So that's definitely more complicated than English in that regard. There are also a number of tenses in use, and this is quite interesting in the sense that a lot of the differences are marked in writing, but are not really audible when you're speaking. So it's easier to get by in French verbally than it is to master in writing. And then there's a really rich vowel system. It sounds very different from the original Latin. We can move to the next slide. It sounds very different from the original Latin because probably the Germans, the Germanic people, when they invaded France, they brought in a lot of their complicated vowel sounds and they got adopted into the French language. So a lot of words don't sound the same as the equivalent words in other languages. Now, here's an interesting thing. France invaded England. Well, the Normans invaded England in, I think, the 12th century. I'm not very good at history. And they brought a whole layer of French vocabulary through the English language. So a lot of these words concern government, law, art, literature, and so on. And it was pretty much the only written language in England for a couple of centuries. So there's a huge, huge influence. In fact, before you even start studying French, if you're an English speaker, you probably know already around 15,000 French words. So examples of the words, I've picked cooking, cuisine, for example, a very French word. You've got such words as cafe and cloche. If you've watched MasterChef, they lift a cloche and reveal a souffle. They cook in a bain-marie with a beurre noisette and a bit of jus, and they gratin and they julienne their vegetables and so on and so forth. And then there are more complicated expressions, I guess, that have filtered into the English language over time, such as avant-garde and carte blanche and cliché, déjà vu. My favorite is je ne sais quoi, which a lot of people like to use. And et voilà, the sense of accomplishment. You've finished something. Et voilà. Let's move to the next slide because et voilà. So around the world, French varies to a significant degree. We don't really have much time to go into detail, but it is spoken in many African countries, and each African country has its own idiosyncrasies in relation to French. But for the most part, you can say that they bring in local influences from their local languages into French. And that might affect French on a grammatical level, or it might affect French in terms of the vocabulary. For the most part, though, in all cases, most of the vocabulary is still identical to Standard French. So Standard French is still a very useful language. So I've got some examples here from the Congo, for example. You have elle me complique, which to a Frenchman sounds completely grammatically odd. And it means she is making my life difficult. So that's a very African structure and an example. And then Simon Mogosur he's my friend. And the word Mogo doesn't really mean anything in French. It comes from a local Ivorian language in this case. And FPA is a Français parlé africain, so it's a sort of spoken French African. I hesitate to call it a dialect, but a form of spoken French. And they've brought their own vocabulary into it. So that's an example.
Sorry to interrupt you there, because we do have a question, and that is about the difference between language, dialect, Creole, Pidgin. Could you just briefly maybe explain what the differences are?
Okay, so quickly. In the case of French, for example, dialects were local. You can call a dialect a language. It's a small local language that hasn't necessarily been formalized. So French was made from many dialects put together, and then somebody formalized them and made a language out of them. Let's say that's the starting point. Then French gets exported around the world, and let's say you go to Mauritius or something like that, where they had their own language, and the French people come in. Then the people who start speaking together come up with a blend. And the less formalized that blend is, it's called a pidgin. And then if it becomes more formalized over generations and the children of the people who spoke the pidgin speak it, it becomes a Creole. I think that's broadly the way around. So one is a more formal version of the other, and Creole and pidgins are basically second generation languages from merged separate ingredients, if that makes any sense. So at one point, you could consider official French as a Creole because it was formalized into a language. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. Andrea, can we roll back because we haven't quite, yeah, so there you talk about, and this is the bit that our clients, I think, would be the most interested in, given the diversity of French, and I guess historically it was a language of diplomacy, and you know, it was the rigueur to speak French, of course, and it's no longer so significant, although it is a language that's an official language of the EU, and one of the official languages, of course, but also the UN, I understand. And a lot of the conversations still happen in French in the corridors of that institution. And I think, I don't know how to say it without sounding a bit offensive, but I think the French in France and also in Canada have something that I would call the French language police, where there's in fact laws preventing from the French language being polluted by English influences, let's say. So where my next question is heading, that somebody's asked, is how different are the Canadian French, the Belgian French, the Luxembourgish French, and can French people across the world understand each other? Is it a bit like English, where, you know, we can understand the American and the New Zealand English, they're mutually intelligible, or is there more to it than that? So, for example, is Canadian French sort of a bit more antiquated? Could you maybe explain that a little?
Okay, so let's start with, yes, French is the official, or was the official diplomatic language of the world. So all diplomacy happened in French, but it's been slowly taken over by English. In the case of Canada, for example, so Belgium is the purest form of French I know. Walloon is probably purer than French from France, in the sense that they've not been too influenced by anything, and they've kept it really pure. There's a man called Grévis who is responsible for writing the Bible of how French should be written, and he's Belgian. So that's one thing that we can say for sure. In Canada, there is a massive influence from English. It's heavily anglicized, as it's written in the slide here, both in terms of vocabulary and syntax, on top of which they have a formidable accent. So if you watch a Canadian program in France, chances are they'll put subtitles on it, because it is quite heavy. It depends how heavy, where in Canada you are as well, because it's a massive country. But they'll say things like, and when you're French, you do not have a clue what that means, because there's a heavy accent. And then there's the term char, which means a chariot. And we don't use chariots, it's a car, but they've taken car from English, changed it to char in French. So they've adapted it. And then means, my God, you know, the suspension in your car is quite flexible. We're bouncing around. So these are rather strange expressions. And then in French, the word for hot dog is hot dog. But in Canadian French is chien chaud, which is a literal translation of hot dog. And it sounds really peculiar in French. I hope I've covered that.
You have. Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting. And I know that the language is such a strange thing in that it's alive and it's got its own rules, and things are created despite what we might think is correct or incorrect, if you know what I mean. And of course, there are really bizarre words that's made it into French from English, like walkie-talkie, that's now become talkie-walkie or something like that. I remember you telling me
Yeah,
really
in French,
bizarre.
walkie-talkie is talkie-walkie. Yes.
Oh, talkie-walkie, sorry. And how do you pronounce Google and Facebook in French?
So Facebook, that's easy. And then Google. We've got a beautiful sound there. Google. Yeah, it's funny how French words get pronounced or mangled. And this is how French feel about Canadian French.
Okay.
So, in many ways. So when we laugh at Google, the French laugh at Canadians.
Okay.
In a similar way.
But it's all, of course, good humoured. So I'm going to hand over to Justine now to cover visually and geographically about where French is spoken, and then we're going to focus back on Australia, because that is where a lot of interest for our clients and people that are watching lies.
Hey, good morning, everyone. So yeah, as you can see, this map shows a bit of where French is spoken over the world. So you have Europe with France, and you have countries, as Dominic said, such as Belgium, Luxembourg, and Switzerland that speaks French. Some parts speak French. Then you have North America with Canada, which has French as one of his official language. You have South America well, because some islands and French Guinea that are located in South America. You have some small parts around Oceania and Pacific that have French speakers, because you have islands such as Vanuatu, French Polynesia, New Caledonia, that are French speakers. And lastly, you have Africa, which is actually home to more French speakers than any other continent. So I think a lot of people may not know that because it's not really obvious, but yeah, Africa is the continent with most French speakers in the world. So now if we speak a bit about French speakers around Australia, so you can see these numbers, which are the top 20 languages that are spoken at home other than English. And French is actually the number 15. So you have around 70,000 people in the country that speaks French at home. Yeah.
And that's grown by about 13,000 since 2011, yeah. So in 5 years. So that's quite a significant increase. And I think French is often not considered a language that people should translate into in Australia. But what it does allow you to do when you do translate into French is reach into smaller communities, because for a lot of those communities, French is a second, third, or sometimes fourth language that they speak. And if you can't, for very, very small communities, say Burundi or something like that, if you wouldn't be able to translate into that particular language, you can use French as a kind of lingua franca, I guess is the explanation that I would use.
Yeah, exactly. And then, so if you want to focus a bit more on Victoria, so you have some numbers here as well, which are still the language spoken at home. And French is the number 19. So you have a bit less than 20,000, and there's still a small rise, about 3,000 in difference between 2011. So if we go, Andrea, to the next slide. Thank you. So you have some other numbers. So we wanted to speak a bit about the African French speakers, but you should not really rely on these numbers because they date from 2006 And unfortunately, we didn't find any new numbers. So it was estimated that almost 250,000 people living in Australia were born in Africa, and around 25.5% of them, which is around 63,000, were coming from Francophone-speaking African countries. So these countries are countries such as Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Guinea, Madagascar, and some other you can see written on the screen. So that's all the numbers we have, and it's apparently very hard to estimate the African population in Australia. But then we found some other numbers concerning French-born people, which are a bit more new because they are from 2016. So there are apparently in that year 31,000 people living in Australia that were born in France. So Andrea could go to the next slide. Of the countries where this French-born community is located around Australia. So the majority of them are in New South Wales, following by Victoria. And then they are a bit everywhere, but yeah, mostly in New South Wales. Concerning Victoria, Andrea, if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So yeah, sorry, about the age of the French-born population in Australia. So as you can see, the median age is 30 years old, and the majority of them are between 25 and 44 years. We don't have a lot of children between 0 and 14 years old, and yeah, that's kind of all. Andrea, sorry. Thank you. And here is just to show you a bit about where French people from France are located around Melbourne area. So they are Melbourne CBD. You have a like Coalfield. Then you have Port Phillip, which includes Melbourne, St Kilda, these kind of suburbs, and you have Stonington, where you have Toorak, South Yarra, that kind of suburbs. So it looks like the French-born community in around Melbourne tends to prefer like South Melbourne.
Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do now is ask Andrea to move us on to the next slide and maybe have a discussion about translation into French, because there was a few things that you guys have said that are very interesting and useful. So one of the things is for translating for French-speaking communities in Australia, is the translation process a bit different, I guess. So, you know, we've put there up on the slide some tips on how to translate into French. So because there are regional variations and people might, you know, speak it as a lingua franca, but have, you know, slight differences, we do advocate to keep it really simple so that it's understandable by any French-speaking person, no matter where they come from. But we've put there to consider the target culture and keeping, you know, the concepts that we are discussing in your source text, in your English text, really simple. So perhaps we could expand on this a little, on how to do it in practice. As we're nearing the end of our presentation, it'll be really good to talk about translation, which is what we do, of course, and how we work with French translators to overcome some of those challenges, which are cultural or linguistic in nature, because just like with Spanish that we had last week, and Andrea was explaining last week that there's one Spanish, but there are regional variations. It's a little bit similar with French, I guess. So maybe we'll just have a discussion about that. And I'll hand over to Dominic for that to get us started.
Okay, so as we've raised before, throughout all the variations that there are of French, there is a great percentage that is similar or identical to standard French. So the sort of French that you learn at school, that gets taught in classrooms, is essentially a lingua franca that would work for anybody who has French as a mother tongue and for anybody who has French as a second language. So we struggled a bit with numbers because the statistics are quite hard to come around and get to in any detail. But broadly, you would be reaching at least 150,000 people, if not more, by using French. And if you kept it to a simple, plain concept, the chances are everybody would understand. In terms of the target culture, in a certain way, if you're going to use one language to reach as many cultures as possible, you kind of have to strip it of as much cultural references as you can. And the next thing is French is often associated with, so standard French is often associated with the educated in cultures where French is not standard, let's say. So you have to consider that normal French, standard French is considered educated in places in African countries, for example, where they've got their own variations. So you need to keep it simple. You need to, again, so the rules are keep it simple, and keep it simple. Also keep it short, because as we'll see probably on the next slide, French tends to occupy more space than English. So when you translate, it will expand inevitably. So whatever you design, you have to bear in mind it will probably increase by 20-25%.
So speaking of the next slide, we'll get our wonderful Andrea to show us the next slide, because believe it or not, we've come to the end of our presentation. So this is the summary of what we did talk about and some of the things that we want you to take away from this session. So over to you, Dominic, again. What should we remember from this presentation today?
Okay, so we should remember that French is a vastly spoken language around the world, and that is not changing. And in fact, in terms of speakers, Africa is the most growing portion. So as long as there are African contingents in Australia, there will be French speakers. It's that simple, especially if they come from Central African countries, Chad, Congo, Côte d'Ivoire, Equatorial Guinea, Madagascar. We've spoken about a few: Morocco, Rwanda, Senegal, Togo, Tunisia, so on and so forth. There are hundreds and hundreds of French speakers, new French speakers, who arrive all the time in Australia. So it's a very important language to translate into. It is important, as I've just mentioned, to bear in mind that it will expand. So when you're designing your concepts and your brochures, be sure to bear that in mind. And you will reach an ever increasing number of people. It will allow you to cut through a lot of, I wouldn't say insignificant languages, but languages that are spoken by few speakers. So in terms of your investment, you get a bigger bang for your buck if you translate into French, because you will have a bigger reach for a smaller budget than if you translate into as many African countries as there are cohorts. And then that's it, I think.
Okay, beautiful. So we do have a couple of questions, and one of them is to Justine, and it is as follows. With the French language, as you're seeing it changing, are there any significant differences between the French that you speak and, say, your parents or grandparents speak?
I won't say so. Maybe sometimes with my grandmother or something, but my parents like kind of have the similar French that I have. But I would say that teenagers or younger people tends to invent some expression or some things at some time, And that's true that at the beginning, my parents don't understand it, but then if you explain it, they will maybe use it, not really, but yeah.
Okay. And a question to Dominic about the French that we can use as essentially to reach communities here in Australia. What would be some of the other challenges? Because we've talked about, so the question is, we've talked about culture, the language, the regional variations. What about, apart from keeping it simple, what would you say would be other tips for anyone that considers French as a language that they want to reach smaller communities? Is there any other tips that you could share with us?
Off the top of my head, this isn't an easy one to understand, to give an answer to. But broadly, a French speaker expects things to be said in a way they expect it to be said, if that's at all a reasonable way of putting it. It's a bit like a game of Cluedo. They expect caramel custard in the cellar with a candlestick or whatever it is.
So it's very structured, is it?
It's very structured, and they won't understand you if you say caramel mustard instead of custard. They'll go, oh no, who is this? What is this? You must be wrong. So you must be extremely clear in what you're saying in French, and adhere, I would still argue, to standard French rules as much as possible, because that is the expectancy that people have when they read French.
Okay, well, what I would just add to that is that a lot of the time when French is considered as a language to translate into, we don't actually translate. We produce resources that are multilingual, but also multimedia. So instead of written translation, we might consider a podcast, a video, a short animation, something like that, because we must also remember that many people for whom French is a second, third or fourth language might not be able to write it because it's such a high level language, I guess, and so proper and so structured. So some people are a bit more, I guess, intimidated, maybe is the word. But they are very conversant. They're very fluent in it, but in a spoken way. So whenever you consider French, I think that's another way of looking at it, that maybe translation as we know it in the written form is not the way to use it, but perhaps some other way of presenting the language to the community is the way to go. Because really at the end of the day, it'll maximize that reach for you. But if you produce a resource that people can't read, that's again, not maximizing it. So really, essentially, to summarize it, French is a great language to translate into for French-speaking communities. So whether they come from France, and often it is true that particularly the newer migrants are English speakers. But as you've seen on Justine's slide, roughly about 15% of French speakers in Australia are over the age of 65. So, you know, that cohort might be small in numbers, but they're high in need, because that French being the 15th language doesn't always get included in everything we translate. But certainly for people that come originally from Africa, French is a wonderful language to produce resources in. The only precaution, I guess, from our project managers at Polaron would be to maybe consider other modalities of presenting that information rather than a written translation. So on that note, we have run out of time terribly, as we always do. It's been fascinating. I wanted to thank you both sincerely, Dominic and Justine, for sharing your knowledge, for preparing this session. I have learned a lot, and hopefully so has everybody else. If you want to talk to us about translating into French, feel free to reach out. And I don't know what we're going to be covering next week, but something as exciting as this week, of course. So thank you, Dominic. Thank you, Justine. And thank you, Andrea, from behind the scenes, managing this wonderful show on a Thursday morning. And everyone stay safe. We see you next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.